Hey guys! Part 7 of What If Naruto Graduates 2 Years Early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 29, Chunin Exams, Invasion. Kakashi watched as his student Sasuke stood facing Gaara. Training Sasuke one-on-one for a month had been rather trying to his patience, especially since he had wanted to do other things at the time, namely train Naruto. The attitude problem alone had been enough to get on his nerves and make him want to strangle the Uchiha boy and bury him in a shallow unmarked grave. That boy never appreciated what was given to him. Probably because just about anything and everything was given to him if he indicated that he wanted it by people who either pitied him for being left alone in the world, or sought a small amount of the power he would hold in the future. When something wasn't handed to him when he wanted it, Sasuke became upset, and exceedingly jealous of anyone who had what he wanted. This character flaw hadn't entirely been because of the massacre though, as Sasuke had been the beloved younger son of the head of the Uchiha clan, and as a result had been spoiled practically from infancy by his clan, especially his older brother. Despite his misgivings, he himself had given Sasuke something most precious, and he was almost certain he would regret it in the future since he already was starting to, because the boy hadn't appreciated it or the other training he had given him. Part of the responsibilities of being a teacher is passing things down to the next generation. He wanted to pass everything he knew down to Naruto, but there was one thing he knew that he unfortunately could not pass down to his sensei's son. In fact, Sasuke was the only member of the next generation that it could be passed down to considering the requirements. There was a good chance that Sasuke would not be his student or his concern for much longer, considering some of the better offers he had gotten for the boy from Jounin who were looking for an apprentice, but, as Sasuke's teacher for however long that he would be, there was one thing he could teach the boy, and that was the Chidori. Which he had. He'd had reservations about teaching the boy the technique, considering the anger problem the child had, and his tendency for overkill, but the technique was too valuable to die with him the way the Hiraishin had died with Minato-sensei. Had there been more Uchiha, however, he would have held out until he had found one who was worthy of learning his signature technique, one who had been more like Obito, one who would have truly appreciated what he'd been given, and the hard work and sacrifice it had represented. That couldn't be though, because all that was left of that clan was a boy who had not appreciated what had been given to him, a boy who was like he had once been in many ways, but far more arrogant than he had ever been. At the very least, he'd had respect for his sensei since day one. Sasuke lacked even that. Hopefully, he wouldn't be seeing the Chidori during this battle since he and Sasuke had gone over several methods the boy could use to get past the Gaara boy's defenses. Methods that had included a couple of lesser and less chakra-intensive lightning jutsu, but considering Sasuke's character, he knew that the boy would be trying it at least once, and would possibly lose the match because of the extensive amount of prep time it took. The match started with Sasuke making a few jabs at the potential unknown that was Gaara of Suna. He had seen surveillance of Gaara in action, and knew that the sand moved on its own, crushing and tearing opponents, and forming a protective barrier around the Suna Genin. What else it could do was uncertain. Lightning, however, was strong against earth-type defenses, so this was a good match for Sasuke, who was of that affinity, as well as fire. He felt Guy stiffen next to him when Sasuke really started to move rather than merely poking the boy's defenses to see what would happen, trying to get around the sand that surrounded his opponent with speed after a minor lightning attack had failed. He knew exactly why. Guy had shown these skills off to him at one point, hoping to impress him, and therefore had recognized Sasuke's new fighting style as a copy of what little of Lee's style he'd observed sped up to Lee's true speed rather than the weighted speed the boy had witnessed when Lee had almost handed him and later Chuji their asses. He could tell that while Guy was impressed with Sasuke's skill, he wasn't happy. Guy had taught Lee his fighting style, because he had selected the boy as his apprentice. To see another using it so casually, especially someone who wasn't his student, someone who hadn't spent so much as an hour learning under him. The Sharingan and its copying ability had fostered resentment wherever the Uchiha, and he himself went, so this was nothing new. Elsewhere in the stands, Tenten found her fists clenching as she watched while Sasuke practically disappeared as he tried to get through the other boys' sand barrier. That little bastard had ripped off Lee's moves. Sure, there were differences here and there, but the main part of it was something Lee had worked hard for day in and day out for, and invested thousands of hours into. Unlike Lee, who'd repeatedly worked until he dropped, and then worked some more to get where he was at, Uchiha had taken one look at Lee's fighting style, and the next thing anybody knew, he was copying Lee at top form. There was a roar of approval from the crowd as Sasuke launched his opponent into the air, and kicked him before he landed. There was an even louder roar when Sasuke got within his opponent's sand defense, and attacked with a weak right on Jibashi. Tenten didn't join in. She now knew exactly why her father had called the Uchiha a thief without any sort of admiration when he did so. Stealing from the enemy was acceptable, even admirable in many cases. Stealing from your comrades the way Sasuke had stolen from Lee and Gai Sensei was not. In the arena below, Gaara called his sand back around him. The Uchiha had driven him back and back and back. He had known when he had run into the boy during a self-guided tour of the village that he was someone who could validate his existence, and he'd been right. The Uchiha was strong, and crushing him would make this entire trip worthwhile. Mother would be tasting the boy's blood soon. He knew that the others would be upset at him for jumping the gun slightly, but that was their problem. He had been prepping for this all day, and would be doing it anyway, so what did a few minutes here or there matter? The Uchiha had been tricky, but as soon as he merged with Mother, the boy would be all out of tricks, and his insides would be outside for all the world to see before Mother gobbled them up, along with the rest of this village. Konoha would be Mother's playground, and its residents her sacrifices, except for the ramen stand owner Tuchi and his daughter, and maybe that blonde boy Naruto. In the Kage box, Orochimaru barely refrained from licking his lips as he watched the Uchiha boy fight. That act of cowardice back in the forest had apparently been pragmatism, which was a useful trait to possess. Even without his seal giving the boy strength, he was strong. Sasuke was strong, and he was fast. He was what he wanted in a vessel, and during the confusion of the battle, Sasuke would be taken to become his. Had Sasuke not proven himself, he would have been taken to where he could be rather publicly and messily executed in order to lower morale amongst any survivors that might get ideas. As a weak Sharingan was worth less than no Sharingan, and there might have been a reason Fugaku had been distant towards his younger son aside from the fact that he'd been unplanned. It wasn't like he couldn't get his hands on an unattached Sharingan and go through the Kakashi method a few times, but he'd prefer to have one he could turn off and didn't have to cover due to vanity, which was something of a failing of his that he'd yet to eliminate. As he watched the action in the arena, he bit back a groan of annoyance when he saw that Gaara was starting to transform before the signal. The bloodthirsty brat was apparently far too eager for the battle to begin. Oh well, it wasn't as if it would ruin his plans or anything. Konoha was as good as destroyed, at the moment, considering the fact that they were mostly unprepared for what was to come. Knowing that what would be coming next would be interesting to say the least, he turned his attention back to the fight. As Gaara sat in his cocoon of sand, Sasuke made his way up the wall of the arena where he stood preparing something. This part of the fight was boring. He hated it when things weren't moving. As he was about to give the signal, if only to end the monotony since Gaara's transformation would take a while, he heard a familiar chirping noise. Little Kakashi had taught him that jutsu? Well, it looked like things were going to get interesting. He would sit back and watch this. As the sound of birds rose to a crescendo, the Uchiha boy raced down the wall towards the sand ball that contained the Ichibi's Jinchuriki, leaving a line of destruction behind him. Seeing as the Chidori could cut through steel, concrete and earth were nothing to it, and didn't slow it down one iota. Practically the instant the boy started down the wall, his arm was through Gaara's sphere of protection, and based on the sounds coming from inside, he had gotten something, but had failed to kill Gaara, who tried to hold his arm in, possibly in order to rip it off. Sasuke managed to free his arm, and a monstrous spike thing that could be a paw or a tail shot out of the hole that Sasuke had made in Gaara's protective sphere, and attacked the boy. Seeing the appendage, he waited for the rest of the transformation, but it didn't happen. The ball of sand disintegrated instead. It seemed that Sasuke had managed to tire Gaara out and get him to use the chakra necessary for the transformation. Oh well. He'd deal with Gaara later. Now, he'd be giving the signal. Without warning, he raced to the railing and launched the smoke canister that would cover his kidnapping of his former sensei, as well as signaled the start of the invasion. Everything was now in motion. That was good. He hated it when things were still. Unexpected cloud of smoke in the kage box. And feathers? Z. Wake up, stupid! Ah wow, huh? What? There seems to be some sort of barrier on the roof above the kage box, and the Hokage and the Kazekage are in the middle of it. Hokage-sama appears to be the Kazekage's captive. One of the ANBU has moved to assist, and is now rolling down the roof in flames. Mizuko groaned and slammed his head into the bar. Why? Why had the Kazekage decided to start a war now of all times? Thanks to his untimely assassination attempt, he was now out 100,000 ryo, as the third phase had apparently been stopped before the tournament could be completed, and Uzumaki Naruto had only won one match instead of all of them. Of all the times this could have happened. Bad luck, man. One of the bar patrons said, a bar patron who was out some money as well, since the phase had ended in an invasion prior to the completion of the finals, which was a legitimate bet that someone who had bet that every Chunin exam had finally made a killing off of. Bad luck? Bad luck? That had been all his available money until his leg healed, and he was able to take missions again in 6 weeks. Thanks to that stupid Kazekage, he was going to be forced to survive on field rations. Bad luck indeed. Has apparently gone after the Sunagenin, who have taken the opportunity to make their escape. A small group of the other competitors have gone out a hole in the wall created by Mado Guy, presumably to assist in dealing with the invasion we are now receiving reports of from the eastern wall. As he listened to the surprisingly calm report given by the radio announcer who had remained at his post chronicling events as they took place, Haku found himself biting his nails, which was a nervous habit he rarely indulged in. He was several days' travel away from his friend's village, and there was nothing he could do to aid Naruto, who had been responsible for his and Zabuza's new lease on life. Had Naruto not gotten the citizens of Wave, and later the Hokage himself to spare them, they would have been long dead before Mai-sama had become Mizukage. He had little doubt that Naruto was amongst the small group of Konoha shinobi who had gone out to help save their village, as he wasn't the sort of coward who would hang back when others were in danger, and he hoped that he would make it out of this battle alive. The Jinchuriki brat'll be fine, Zabuza-sama said, accurately guessing his fears as always, and trying to allay them even though he seemed slightly uncertain himself. He smiled. He would trust in Zabuza-sama, and he would trust in Naruto. Naruto would make it through this, and knowing him, he would probably save the day while doing so. Apparently isn't the Kazekage, but rather the missing Nin Orochimaru, who is one of the legendary Sannin who had been the Hokage's students. Hokage-sama has engaged him in battle, starting off with a tile shuriken jutsu. The cheering of the Suna and the IWA Nin who had stayed to listen to Sasuke's match had been silenced by a few well-placed kunai moments earlier, much to the surprise of one Hashigaki Kisame who had never seen Itachi kill anyone he didn't feel he had to. He had told Kisame that it had been because they had been giving him a headache, but he suspected that Kisame knew otherwise. Despite his exile, he was still loyal to Konoha and his little brother. Both were in danger now, and there was nothing he could do about it but sit and listen as the battle, which was a day's journey from here, unfolded. He would be praying that both Sasuke and his village survived. If one or the other fell in this battle, there would be hell to pay. He was usually a pacifist, but he had killed before, and would kill again if anything happened to Sasuke. If Sasuke died, the rivers would run red with the blood of every last ninja from Suna and the new village Oto, and Orochimaru would be staked out for the carrion crows to feast upon. Chapter 30, Chunin Exams, Gaara. As she, Naruto, Pakken, and Shikamaru, who had eventually left their group in order to delay their pursuers, ran through the forest, Sakura had a silent prayer of hope that they would make it in time, running repeatedly through her head like a mantra. Sasuke had gone tearing out of the arena after the trio of genin from Suna, and Kakashi had ordered them to go and retrieve him before he got into any trouble he couldn't handle. An invasion like this was just the sort of perfect opportunity to kidnap Sasuke, or anyone else for that matter, for any one of a wide variety of reasons. Naruto had pointed out the risk to her a few months ago, the risk that was all the more present today when anybody could use the invasion as cover. And she now found herself slightly worrying about her classmates who were currently still under the effects of the genjutsu that had been cast over the entire arena, that were the offspring of the heads of their clans the way Sasuke was his. Hyuga Hinata was especially vulnerable since she hadn't entirely recovered from her fight with Niji during the preliminaries. For all she knew, the 3 fleeing genin had been bait in a larger trap, and for some reason the proctor had allowed and even encouraged Sasuke to take it. Eventually, as she came close to catching up to her target, she had heard a very familiar sound, a sound she had first heard on the bridge in Wave, the sound of a multitude of chirping, shrieking birds. Sasuke was still alive. She had gotten there in time. While he was still alive, Sasuke was exhausted and or wounded and unable to move, however. The boy named Gaara, who looked more like a monstrous animal than a human being, now moved in to attack. Before she could come to Sasuke's aid, Naruto blocked him. When Gaara went to attack again, she blocked him despite the fact that she was still injured from her fight in the arena and wasn't in top form at the moment. She was easily swept aside and slammed into a tree. As she lost consciousness, all she could think was, "I failed." Sasuke gasped as a new pain from his ribs stabbed him. Apparently, at least one of them had cracked during his struggle with Gaara. His opponent was completely insane, and rapidly turning into a monster, just like Naruto had that one time on the bridge. He had chased Gaara all the way from the arena, almost being stopped twice, once by Temari, who had been slowed down by the injuries that Sakura had given her, and once by Kankuro, who had ended up fighting Aburame Shino, who had apparently been somewhat peeved by the fact that the invasion had robbed him of his chance at fighting the older boy in the quarterfinals as he felt he was supposed to, never mind the fact that Kankuro had already lost to that Lee boy, tanking those plans. In the end, they had come to this point where Gaara had started turning into a monster, and ranting about him being his prey since they had the same cold, lonely, murderous eyes. Considering what was going on, Gaara obviously had one of the biju sealed into him the way Naruto had, and turning it loose like this obviously drove him insane the way it had Naruto that day on the bridge. As the half-human monstrosity spoke of loving and only fighting for oneself, he powered a third Chidori, aware of the possible consequences. He stood with Kakashi in front of a stone with 2 holes blasted in it. 2 seems to be your current limit, Kakashi casually remarked. If you try for 3, it won't work properly, and it will drain all your chakra, as it is a very chakra-intensive jutsu, especially because you have to keep your Sharingan activated as well, which puts an additional drain on your chakra. If you try to force it too much, you could die. He stood there panting, as he tried to catch his breath. He was well aware of the probable consequences of chakra exhaustion. He'd sat through the lectures the same as everyone else, at the academy, and had sat through several lectures at home before the massacre. You'll most likely try it anyway considering what an arrogant brat you are, which is a pity, Kakashi said. With the way things are now, very few would mourn your passing. He would not die here at the claws of this bloodthirsty monster, however. He had been left alive in order to avenge his clan, and he would not die before he did so. He leapt into the air at the same time Gaara did. As he flew through the air, the Chidori that had gathered in his hand fizzled and began to die. It had been just enough to save him from death by Gaara's sand claws, however, but he was weak and could barely move. Gaara leaped to attack him again, and was batted away by something that was dark orange and brown topped with yellow. Gaara moved to attack him again, but was blocked by Sakura. Gaara swept her aside, but instead of landing a killing blow as he had half expected the mad Jinchuriki would do, he pinned her to the tree they were in, looking extremely pained as he did so. I won't allow you to hurt my teammates, that boy yelled as he moved in to defend him and Sakura, who looked like she had lost consciousness from the monstrous Gaara's attack. Do you know why few would mourn your passing if you died now? Kakashi asked from the other side of the campfire after the day's training had ended. From your silence, I guess the answer is no, Kakashi said a few moments later. It's because you're an arrogant and ungrateful bastard, like I used to be when I was your age, but worse, Kakashi continued as he poked the fire. People have tried to be there for you, but you threw their kindness back in their faces every time, and took everything they gave you as if you were entitled to it, never once being grateful for what you had been given, even after people had given you things that were most precious to them. If you even knew the number of people who had sacrificed their lives so you could sit here scowling at your dinner," Kakashi said as he took a bite of whatever the hell it was he just finished cooking and had dished out on a pair of plates a few minutes earlier. "Who am I kidding? You wouldn't care." While he sat there unable to move or do anything, Sakura had risked her life to protect him, and now Naruto was engaged in a battle between demons in order to protect him and Sakura. While it was likely that the boy who contained the strongest of the Biju would survive, Sakura could have quite easily died when she had stood between him and Gaara, and it was only due to a whim of Gaara's that she was currently alive and unconscious. Sakura had essentially sacrificed herself to save him. If you even knew the number of people who had sacrificed their lives so you could sit here scowling at your dinner," Kakashi said as he took a bite of whatever the hell it was he just finished cooking and had dished out on a pair of plates a few minutes earlier. "Who am I kidding? You wouldn't care." As Naruto looked into the empty depths of his opponent's eyes and listened to him talk of fighting only for oneself and loving only oneself, he found himself wondering if this monster before him could have been him. He knew that letting the demon out like this boy seemed to have done if his words and transformation were any indication drove even the sanest people insane, but he didn't think that Gaara was all that stable to begin with considering the fear with which his comrades regarded him. There had been a time when he had gone almost completely mad from the loneliness he'd been forced to live with for most of his short life. There had been a time when he had come close to snapping, a time when he had almost become the monster Sakura had feared he was when she had first joined Team 7. There had been a time when he had stood there looking at people and imagined stabbing them if only so that cold look in their eyes would change for a second, and they would see him, and acknowledge him. Before Iruka, his pranks had started to get even more vicious with each passing month. If Iruka had remained the way he had in the beginning, if his first team hadn't acknowledged him, and Tetsuo-sensei hadn't warmed up to him, if he hadn't met Kakashi, would he be the way this boy was now, a cold, lonely killer who seemed to enjoy the act if only because of the acknowledgement he got from it? Though the question gnawed at him every time he looked into the red-haired boy's eyes, it didn't matter now even though it would more than likely haunt him later. He would do what he had to make sure that his opponent didn't harm his comrades or anyone else in Konoha. If he had to kill him, he would. He didn't like killing, and the thought of killing someone he had been ready to call friend before this had happened sickened him, but he would do what was necessary, and it was starting to look like the only option for stopping the other Jinchuriki. His absolute least favorite fight wasn't a straight-up fight without any prior preparation, it was fighting an opponent you could understand and see yourself in. Gaara had wanted love, never received it, and finally went mad because of it. He'd teetered on the brink himself, as the only person who even seemed to care for him had never had time for him, but Iruka-sensei had pulled him back. When he'd graduated from the academy, Iruka-sensei had then handed him over to his first team who pulled him even further from the edge. There apparently hadn't been anyone to pull Gaara away from the edge, just people who pushed him closer until he fell off. As he fought, turning even more into the beast within with each passing second, Gaara growled in frustration at the one who wouldn't quit, wouldn't die, and constantly put his life on the line for his comrades instead of himself. He had wanted to spare the other boy who had treated him nicely and introduced him to Tuchi-san, but he was becoming a threat to his existence, and he had to destroy every threat to his existence before they destroyed him. The other boy who didn't know when to quit pushed him and battered him back and back and back with traps and blows and every dirty trick in the book until he'd been forced to subsume his will to that of Shikaku. When he suddenly found himself awakened by a powerful blow, he found himself looking into a pair of red slit-pupiled eyes. He heard a growl as a set of claws descended to end his existence. This was it, this was the end. After everything he'd survived, all the assassins who'd been sent by his own father, he was dying at the hands of someone he had almost thought he could call friend. He should have known this would be his fate considering what had happened with his uncle Yashimaru. No! His opponent yelled when his claws were a half-inch away from his throat. No. My mother trusted me. The Yandame trusted me. Iruka-sensei, Tetsuo-sensei, Morishita-san, Kakashi, Sakura-san, and Sasuke trust me, I can't. I won't. Not again. Never again. As the claws and the odd markings on the blond boy's face receded and his eyes returned to blue, something started to make a sick sort of sense, such as the cold glares that had been directed at the kind boy by a large number of the villagers. Naruto was like him, but he couldn't be. How could a monster like him be so kind, so caring, so willing to risk his life for others? He was still wondering that when the fight ended and he found himself falling to the ground alongside his opponent as Shikaku's form dissolved around him, either able to fight any longer, much less check their landing. Even then, after they had hit the ground, Naruto had forced himself to move forward, intent on saving his comrade who had been pinned to a tree by his sand earlier. If their respective teammates hadn't separated them, and Temari and Kankuro hadn't carried him off, he had no doubt that Naruto would have done what it took, even if it killed him. Naruto, who had been willing to risk everything for others, who had cared for others instead of only for himself, had proven the stronger of the two, and it hadn't been because he possessed the stronger demon, whichever one it was. It was plainly obvious that people hated Naruto and feared him, but he had somehow managed to find people who cared for him as well. Would he find such people one day? He may have found a few before, but would they still be there after what he had done? "I'm sorry," he said, apologizing to everyone he hurt, including the brother and sister who were carrying him to safety despite the number of times he had threatened to kill them. It was more than likely far too late though, and in any number of cases it was most definitely far too late. In the future, he would have to do his best not to hurt anyone else though, and hope that someone would come and fill that aching emptiness one day. Someone like Naruto. Chapter 31, Tsunade Retrieval, Kage Funeral. A few days after the Chunin exam's invasion, as it was being called, after the job of making sure all of the invading forces had been driven out was complete, Naruto walked to the roof of the Hokage Tower where the Sandame's funeral would be taking place alone. Doing his best to ignore the fact that even people who would say hello to him a few days ago were skirting him as if they were afraid. He knew why though. When he received the news that the old man was dead shortly after the battle ended, he had completely lost it. Fortunately, he had managed to cling to what little sanity he could until he made it a little ways outside the village. While he was out there, he'd almost completely destroyed about a good square mile of forest before he collapsed. He had wanted to go to both Suna and Oto and tear every last one of those ninja apart, including Gaara and his teammates who had smiled to his face and plotted war behind his back. Then, last night, the news came in first via Messenger Hawk, then via a runner who had willingly undergone interrogation, news that left him shocked and confused when he'd read the special edition of that morning's paper. Suna had surrendered to Konoha unconditionally, and was willing to meet any demands that Konoha made. They claimed that they had been tricked into invading, and that they had the evidence to prove it. Apparently, the Yandame Kazekage had been murdered by Orochimaru, who had impersonated him during the Chunin exams and quite likely for a long time before. According to the account that had been given, the Yandame Kazekage had gone to a negotiation meeting with Orochimaru a couple months ago, and had been killed because he had given Orochimaru an answer he hadn't liked. As he walked to the tower and the funeral service for the fallen, which had included the Hokage who'd been one of the few people to care for him before he'd found his team amidst a sea of mourners all dressed in black as he was, he found himself recalling parts of the oath he had proudly given along with the members of the other graduating teams that year while standing next to his teammates in the Hokage's office on the day he had officially become a shinobi of Konoha. Hereby swear to serve and protect the Hokage, the village of Konoha, and the land of fire. Swear to follow the orders given to me to the best of my abilities. If I am called up in a time of war, I will serve without reservations. Undoubtedly, every last one of the ninja of Suna had probably given a similar oath before the Kazekage the day they became genin, and it had been because of that oath that most of them had fought, and because of that oath that many of them had died. The bastard who had killed both the Hokage and the Kazekage had stolen the service and the lives of those ninja. Not only that, but that bastard had caused the death of a large number of Konoha's citizens, shinobi and civilian alike. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be friends with Gaara and his teammates after the way they had betrayed him, but he would save his true hatred for the bastard who had killed the Hokage, Orochimaru. Feeling this hatred, he was beginning to be able to understand Sasuke's drive to be an avenger a little bit. There was someone he too would kill without fail. If it took 1 year or 100 to become strong enough, he would kill Orochimaru. Itachi knew that Kisame more than likely suspected that he was up to something. He'd left their camp so early that morning that it was practically night. When he had reached Otafukigai, he had rented a room for a couple of hours, and underwent something of a transformation. He knew better than to use genjutsu today because it would be spotted immediately where he was going. Most of the people he would be around would be ninjas after all. Looking in the mirror now, he barely recognized himself. Thanks to a temporary dye that took a special solution to wash out, his hair was a medium brown, his eyes were hazel thanks to contacts, and his skin was slightly darker than normal, but not so dark it looked out of place thanks to a pigment enhancer. Finally, there was one last thing to do. He pulled off his usual clothing, and put on the outfit he'd managed to acquire in the small town that had a large number of businesses that were open at all hours due to its proximity to a shinobi village. He'd had an outfit that was nearly identical to the one he was putting on a while back, but he'd long since outgrown it. With a final pull on the unadorned black top to smooth out any wrinkles, he was fully dressed in an outfit he didn't like because of what it represented. He hadn't worn clothes like these in nearly 5 years, and the last time he did so had been while quietly hiding in a tree, silently praying that nobody would notice him since that would force him to defend himself, while also hoping that someone would spot him and kill him. After one last check in the mirror, he was finally ready to go. He turned towards the open window and headed out towards Konoha, which still held his loyalty if only because of all he had sacrificed for it, and the funeral of a man that he both loved and hated. Toby popped off his mask and became Obito once more, if only for a little while. Obito pulled off his usual outfit which, while dark enough, wouldn't have been proper for where he was going, and donned the outfit he had purchased before he checked in at the inn he was staying at the night before. With a little white in his hair to make him look older than his 26 years, a bit of makeup to cover the differing skin tones that were a result of half his body having been replaced with a zetsu, and a change to his walk, he was no longer Obito, but just another old war veteran who hadn't had the sense to die when he should have. He promised Itachi he would stay away from Konoha, and he was usually a man of his word, for as long as the person he'd given his word to was alive at least. No matter how stupid he thought the promise he made was, he generally kept it. But he wouldn't be keeping it on this day, since he wasn't about to miss the old man's funeral much as he hadn't that of his former sensei. As long as he didn't cause any mischief, nobody would need to know that he hadn't entirely kept his promise this time. As he stepped outside the inn and joined the parade of mourners that wandered past, he adopted an appropriately solemn expression. Internally, however, he wasn't nearly as contrite despite the fact that part of him still respected the Sandaime, if only because he'd been trained to do so since birth. He'd stopped caring about Konoha long ago, after everything of value that had made the place his home had up and died on him. Elsewhere in Konoha, Danzo sighed as he carefully arranged his clothing. Unlike the other 2 council members who had also been Sarutobi's teammates and fellow students under the Shodai and Nidaime Hokages, he would not be standing at the front giving the eulogy. He would be standing at the back, in the shadows where he belonged instead. To be honest, he had almost been tempted to skip this altogether. He had both loved and hated Sarutobi, and for a long time that hatred had come to eclipse their friendship. He'd not seen eye to eye with the man on a great many issues over the past several decades, and believed that the man had ruled Konoha with too soft a touch, and had been too soft on the other countries, and given away far more than Konoha could afford in the hope of maintaining peace as well. It had been because of this that people had thought Konoha weak enough to invade, and finally did so. Of the 2 of them, Sarutobi had always been just the tiniest bit faster, smarter, stronger, and better all around, and he had struggled long and hard to catch up only to fall further and further behind. It had been that Sarutobi, the one who had offered to sacrifice himself while he was still working up the courage to do so, the one who had been Hokage, that he had hated. The Sarutobi that he used to run around Konoha and play with as a child, the Sarutobi who had sworn that they would be friends forever and did his best to keep that promise no matter how difficult he made it, had been the Sarutobi he had loved. It was for that Sarutobi that he was attending this funeral. Once everything was finally in order, he grabbed his cane and headed out to the funeral of the last of his friends. In Suna, a different funeral was taking place. While it too was for a Kage, it was for the Kazekage. As Baki stood in the crowd and waited for Chiyo, who stood next to the Yondaime Kazekage's 3 stony-faced children who stoically stood out in the hot sun dressed completely in black to start the eulogy, he found himself wondering what his former Kage's reaction would have been if he ever learned that his funeral had been scheduled to start 10 minutes after the Hokage's, despite the fact that it could have waited a little longer considering the fact that the man's remains had been skeletonized and there was no particular rush to get him into the ground. The man who had little to no love for the Sandaime Hokage would probably have taken it as an insult, and he could practically see the man who had appointed him to the position of jounin instructor to his 3 children swelling in outrage. The Yondaime Kazekage hadn't deserved this slight that Chiyo and several of the elders who had taken over the village until a new Kazekage was named had bestowed on him, however. It wasn't his fault that the invasion had failed, considering the fact that it wasn't his plan in the first place, and the fact that he obviously hadn't signed off on it. While the Yondaime had been rather cold to those around him, he had deeply cared for his village and was willing to sacrifice anything and everything for it, and that had been why he and many others had been willing to follow him without question. Had he or someone else for that matter questioned just once, then maybe they would have realized that their Kazekage had been replaced by an imposter. The Yondaime tended to get upset when his decisions were questioned, and tended to behave in a certain manner when he was upset, with differing reactions depending on exactly how pissed he was. The only person he'd seen come close to imitating the Yondaime when he'd had his feathers ruffled was Gaara, oddly enough. But then again, Gaara was his father's spitting image despite his odd coloring, which was undoubtedly due to Shikaku's influence, so that shouldn't really be a surprise. After what seemed like an eternity, Chiyo finally began to speak. Getting the honored grandmother Chiyo to give the eulogy had been quite the accomplishment for whoever managed it, considering the fact that Chiyo and her brother had sworn to stay out of the village affairs when they had retired over a decade ago, and the fact that both of them had severely disliked the Kazekage. Come to think of it, the timing of the Kazekage's funeral was more than likely Chiyo's doing. Temari watched her youngest brother out of the corner of her eye. Gaara had been behaving strangely since the failed invasion of Konoha, and she wasn't sure how she should react. He had been rather quiet on the run back to Suna, and had gone off on his own when they had learned of their father's death, only returning this morning in time for the funeral. In the time that he had been there, he had never once threatened to kill her, her brother, or anyone else for that matter. Usually, there would be at least 3 death threats a day, and one could generally gauge his mood by the number of death threats or actual deaths he handed out. It was strange seeing him standing there alongside them. Up until they had been grouped together onto a genin team, Gaara had been kept separate from them, mainly for her and Kankuro's safety. She had caught a few glimpses of Gaara here and there while he was wandering about the village and saw him on occasion when she had stopped to visit Uncle Yashimaru before then, but that had been about it as far as contact had been concerned. Was father of 3 fine shinobi, Chiyo Basama said, as the eulogy that she had only been half listening to droned on. It seemed that Chiyo hadn't been willing to stretch the truth so far as to say that her father had been a loving father. He hadn't. He'd been cold, he'd been distant, and he'd sacrificed their mother in order to seal a demon inside their younger brother. He'd been her father, however, and she had loved him. She would also miss him greatly now that he was gone. The Sandaime Tsuchikage Oinoki listened almost sadly as an era ended. Though he shouldn't have, he'd had the Yondaime Kazekage's funeral tape so he could listen to it later. He had known the Sandaime Hokage for far longer than he'd known the youngster in the Kazekage's robes, and had faced him on the field of battle on a few occasions. In a choice of whose funeral to listen to live, there was no contest, and it had been Suna's fault for scheduling their Kage's funeral for the same day as that of the Hokage. With the professor's passing, Iwa was now the only village that was ruled by a Sandaime Kage. The other villages were now on Yondaimes, or Godaimes, and soon, when 2 names were selected and announced, the majority of the 5 major villages of the elemental countries would be ruled by a Godaime Kage. Realizing this rather than ignoring it like he usually did, he found that it seemed as if the world was rapidly leaving him behind. The Yandame Reikuje sat at his desk flipping between two radio stations, hoping that he didn't miss anything important on the other station each time he did so. Much to his irritation, Konoha and Suna had scheduled their Kage's funerals for the same day at the same time. Since radios came into use, it was expected that if a Kage could not attend the funeral of another Kage for whatever reason, such as little to no advance notice, as was often the case since Kages rarely died of natural causes, they would listen to it on the radio. Important events in hidden villages were almost never televised due to the amount of information on village layout that enemies could garner from the broadcast, amongst other things. Though it was annoying, and it was an unwritten rule, it was a rule nonetheless, a rule that was almost ruthlessly reinforced by his peers. Knowing their nature, he half expects that diplomats from either village will comment on things said during the funerals to test and see if he'd actually been listening, in a morbid imitation of a pop quiz. Considering the fact that it would just make him look even more of an uncultured barbarian, he doesn't want to get the answers wrong. He already has something of a reputation for being a slightly uncouth meathead, and he doesn't need something like that adding to it. So, while he would much rather be doing other things, such as dealing with the ever-present paperwork that was breeding on his desk, he forced himself to flip between two stations and attempt to at the very least catch the highlights of the funerals of two of his peers. In Kiri, Zabuza seemingly casually leaned against his wife's desk as she sat listening to the broadcasts that were coming in from a pair of radios that had been set up. In addition to being his wife's advisor, he was her primary bodyguard as well, which meant that he spent almost every waking moment with his wife, as well as just about every sleeping one now that he'd acclimated himself to her presence. Though he would eventually have to comment on it, he had little to no interest in listening to what was coming in over the radios, as he had had very little interest in either the Sandame Hokage or the Yandame Kazekage, and didn't particularly care to listen to a couple of pompous elderly windbags sing their praises. The Sandame Hokage's funeral, however, was slightly more interesting of the two, since it wasn't solely about the Hokage, but was a combined funeral for all who had died during the invasion that had disrupted the Chunin exams. Eventually, the two funerals were over, and Mei turned off both radios before turning back to her work. There was never much time for mourning the dead in Kirigakure, especially for someone like the Mizukage. There was far too much that needed to be done for the living. Chapter 32, Tsunade Retrieval, Godame Hokage? Danzo snorted from his hiding spot as Jiraiya reacted to his fellow council members' offer exactly how he predicted he would. Considering the mutual antagonism they had going, he knew that Jiraiya's answer wouldn't have been half as polite as it had been if he'd been there alongside Sarutobi's teammates while they made the offer. As it was, the man's refusal was somewhat rude, as he seemed far more interested in staring at the hot springs than he was in being offered the position of Godame Hokage. That had been a deliberate slight though, since Jiraiya barely tolerated Koharu and Hamura, and didn't tolerate him at all. There had been a time that Jiraiya had tolerated him, but after a run-in with one of the root agents in which Jiraiya had been forced to kill the kid, that forbearance had rapidly melted away like snow on a hot summer day. Considering the fact that his petition to the daimyo had failed yet again, and the fact that the slippery little weasel had yet again sent a letter leaving the choice up to them rather than coming to Konoha where he could use Shusui's eye on him, it seemed that Tsunade would be the new Hokage despite the fact that she'd abandoned Konoha more than a decade ago. He had no doubt that Jiraiya would somehow make this so, even if he had to forcibly drag the legendary sucker all the way back to Konoha and chain her to the Hokage's desk in order to escape the position himself. It was just as well, since Tsunade was the more responsible of the two, if only marginally. The upside to this situation though was that he would be able to slip far more past Tsunade than he would Jiraiya. Jiraiya's choice of traveling companion on his journey to retrieve Tsunade was all too predictable as well. He'd seen the papers making the boy his apprentice shortly after they'd hit the Hokage's desk, and because the boy was Jiraiya's apprentice, the man couldn't not bring the boy along. That, and since the man preferred traveling alone since it called less attention to himself, it was fully expected that he would reject a team of ninja out of hand, since it wasn't as if the man wasn't capable of dealing with any difficulty that cropped up along the way. Now that that matter was settled, and that Jiraiya actually accepting the position of Godame Hokage, as there was a small possibility of him doing so, hadn't happened, it was time to get ready for the arrival of his new and most likely only marginally willing Hokage. As he overlooked the forest from a conveniently high point, Tenzo whistled as he saw the full devastation that had been wrought by the Kyubi Jinchuriki's rampage. You could build a whole damn town complete with a couple outlying farms in the clearing the boy had created in what had once been a dense forest. Fortunately for Konoha, that clearing hadn't been swept through the middle of the village, as might have happened considering some of the other Jinchuriki rampages he'd heard tales of. People were understandably afraid of the power the boy wielded, especially the civilians who lacked knowledge of the shinobi arts, and saw them as being magic or the closest thing to. Some of the more superstitious people who believed that Naruto was the demon he contained had come to believe that the Sandaime had placed some sort of spell on the boy that had worn off when he passed. Others had come to believe that the Yandaime's seal had broken, and in a way, they were right. The seal was indeed weakening, and would likely weaken even further every time the boy brought out the Kyubi's power, but that was apparently intended to happen, considering how all of the other Jinchuriki tended to merge with their Biju during battle the way the Suna Jinchuriki had merged with Shikaku. The only question was if Naruto would be able to control that power or if it would control him. The reason he knew so much about Naruto's seal and the way it was intended to function was because he had gotten the information that backed up his assumptions about Naruto's seal when he'd done research on the Biju in order to learn how to contain and control them with the power he had gotten from Orochimaru's experiments with the Shodai Hokages. DNA. That was a matter for another day, however. Right now, it was time to get to work. Mokutan, Mori no Jutsu, he yelled as he slapped his hands against the ground and caused several dozen trees to grow. This was only a small start, however, and it would take him a while to finish, especially since he'd be growing houses in Konoha as well. If anyone had stopped and asked him, he would state that as for how he himself currently felt about Naruto's power, it was that he was annoyed at the amount of work the boy had made for him in the space of a single afternoon because of it. As he watched his young student, Baki briefly wondered what it had been that had caused Gaara to run for the toilet. One second the boy was studying a couple of books, and the next he was running for the bathroom. When he pressed his ear to the door, he hadn't heard the boy vomiting as he half expected him to be, but instead it sounded as if he'd been crying? Maybe not crying, but at the very least, he sounded rather upset, and not in the "stop annoying me or I'll kill you" way. After his father's funeral, Gaara had demanded several books on Konoha history, and every bingo book that contained entries with the name Uzumaki in them. Based on the unusual requests, he guessed that the boy was doing research on the boy who had defeated him, which was rather unusual. But then again, since Gaara had never been defeated before, the whole situation was unusual. Since it seemed as if the situation with his student would hold for a while, he decided to investigate. Moving over to the desk to see exactly what it could have been that had upset the boy so badly, he noted that only 2 books were open out of a stack of 30. One was a rather dated bingo book from sometime during the Third Shinobi World War, and the other was a recent Konoha Ninja Academy history textbook. The Academy textbook was open to a page that contained a close-up view of the Yandaime Hokage, which looked like his last official photograph before he was appointed to the position. The bingo book was open to an entry for one Uzumaki Kushina nicknamed the Red Hot-Blooded Habanero. The Uzumaki woman was very attractive, and looked familiar for some reason. Maybe he'd faced her in battle when he was a genin or during his early days as a chunin. Funny, it looked as if Gaara had traced 3 lines on each of her cheeks with the pencil that he'd been using to take notes. Of course, if you rounded out the chin a little bit, and changed the hair and eye color from red and gray to blonde and blue, and gave her a bit of a tan, she'd practically be the spitting image of the Uzumaki boy. Why would that upset Gaara though? No, it wasn't just that. 2 books were open. One to the picture of a woman from whom Gaara's opponent had gained his looks, and the other to the picture of a man who, now that he thought about it, had blonde hair, blue eyes though they'd been inexplicably changed to green in the Konoha history book, and a somewhat rounded chin. Oh freaking hell. Yeah, that would give Gaara issues. Back in Konoha, Sakura had been eating a quick lunch after having helped her mother put things in order all that morning when Sasuke showed up out of the blue. Working on their home to make it reasonably presentable, if not presentable enough for the likes of Uchiha Sasuke, had been a task that had taken several days of working off and on. From the looks of things when they'd gotten home, Some of the enemy ninja had trashed their place for the heck of it, and some Konoha ninja had caught them in the act at some point. Fortunately, they hadn't been stuck with the task of dragging the corpses of enemy ninja out of their home as one of their neighbors down the street had had to do, since someone had rather thoughtfully thrown them out of one or more of the windows for them. "What are you doing here?" she asked in surprise. Sasuke never showed up at her place, and since she'd spent the entire morning repainting the living room to cover the scorch marks from what looked to have been a battle that had taken place, with one ninja standing on the now destroyed sofa and the other on the armchair, she hadn't had the time to fix her hair, much less dress herself properly. Sasuke said, then paused. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked, somewhat startled. Sasuke had rarely if ever thanked her before. "For standing between me and Gaara during the invasion," Sasuke replied. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "You're my teammate, and that's what teammates do for each other." Sasuke looked startled at this statement for some reason. She didn't know why, though. If it had been her that was being attacked, Sasuke would have instantly leapt to her aid, right? Elsewhere in Konoha, Itachi sighed as he settled into his seat at what had been his favorite tea shop when he'd still been living in the village. He and Kisame had set out from the inn after he'd stripped off his disguise from the funeral the day before, and had arrived early that morning and had wandered around the village looking for the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. In reality, Kisame had been looking either that or he took the opportunity of his partner's absence to play hooky, and he had gone off to give his ultimatum to the council, ensuring that Sasuke would be safe for a while longer. He knew that he had some time to waste, since he had little doubt that Naruto would show up at his apartment at some point that day, and he and Kisame could ambush him there if he couldn't find any way to get out of this. Seeing as he had nothing better to do, he was going to spend the rest of the day trying to find out where Naruto lives, despite the fact that he was almost 100% certain that the boy was in the same apartment he had been in since before he'd left the village. He knew where it was because he had been on patrol in that neighborhood before, and had nearly gotten tagged by a water balloon that had somehow been filled with rotten eggs. He had little doubt that the balloon had been intended for the rather unpleasant ANB that usually patrolled the area during that shift, seeing as he'd done nothing to antagonize the boy prior to the event. As he and Kisame sipped their tea and prepared to eat their order of dango, 3 shinobi that he'd rather not face showed up. Asuma and Kurenai, who had apparently come on a date, and Kakashi, who had come to get some offerings for Obito and Ai, and was waiting for Sasuke. When Sasuke showed up, he and Kisame took the opportunity of the distraction he presented to vanish. As he hid on the roof of the tea house and waited for the shinobi to go off in pursuit of him and his partner, he heard Sasuke say, "Why aren't you bringing Naruto?" And Kakashi replied, "Because if Naruto hasn't left already, he will shortly be leaving the village to go on a trip with Jiraiya." Crap. That just made things a bit more complicated. Naruto had been about to go to Ichiraku Ramen and get lunch when Jiraiya had shown up and started talking some nonsense about going on a trip. At first, he couldn't believe what he was hearing, and was almost convinced that he was having an auditory hallucination or that someone had cast a prank genjutsu on him. What the white-haired pervert was saying had to be the most irresponsible thing he had ever heard. There was no way in hell that he would be going off and playing hooky with this guy when he had responsibilities here. And he most definitely did not owe the man for teaching him how to summon toads, even if Gamabunta may have saved his life during that battle with Gaara. "Let me get this straight," he said to the white-haired pervert. "Konoha's in shambles, and we're down by about half our ninja force due to all of the dead and injured, and you want me to go with you while you research some woman?" "That about sums it up, yes," Jiraiya said, smiling. "How about a screw into you, and I'm getting back to work," he said as he turned to leave. On his way down the alley, he caught something that had been aimed at his head. When he examined the object, he found that it was what looked like a mission scroll. "What's this?" he asked. "Well, I hadn't wanted to make it official, but I will if I have to," Jiraiya said. "You're going with me whether you like it or not." "On whose authority?" he asked, not even bothering to open the scroll that could easily be a fake, considering the reputed sealing skills of the man standing before him. "That of Konoha's full emergency council," Jiraiya replied. Great. It seemed that they wanted him gone, temporarily at the very least. Well, it wasn't like it wasn't his fault. Losing control and setting the damn QB loose like that naturally had its consequences, and being dragged out of town for who knew how long by the white-haired pervert until things settled and a more permanent decision could be reached was obviously one of them. Though he didn't think he was the best person to be with considering the fact that he'd actually tried to get him to use the QB's chakra before. "I'll go and pack," he snarled. "Cheer up," Jiraiya called after him as he walked off. "It's not going to be that bad. Besides, I plan on teaching you a thing or two while we're on the road." Shrugging and muttering whatever as he ditched the old pervert, he made his way to his apartment, and opened the scroll when he got there so he had a clear idea of what he should be packing. Apparently, he was being sent on a B-ranked mission to retrieve the Godame Hokage? Chapter 33, Tsunade Retrieval, Itachi. Naruto sighed as he trailed behind the white-haired pervert that he could be spending a long while with, considering the fact that the man didn't actually know where the new Godame Hokage was at the moment, and would have to hunt her down. When a shinobi of a Sannin's caliber didn't want to be found, well, at least they had a Sannin tracking her. As he trailed behind his team leader on a team that consisted of 2 people, him and the white-haired pervert, he wondered why the man hadn't told him that they were going to retrieve the Godame in the first place, and why he had pretended to be going off to party while Konoha was in shambles. After a while, he realized that it was because they could have been overheard, quite possibly by someone who could innocently let the information slip to the wrong person. If their enemies in Otogekure who had yet to make a second attack, or any other enemies for that matter, got this information, they could send out a team to assassinate their new Hokage before she reached Konoha, further weakening the village as the next candidate would not be as strong as her. The woman Tsunade, whom his brief research indicated was a healer of great renown, had been selected because she was the best for the job, both politically and in matters of strength. As the granddaughter of the Shodame and student of the Sandame, she would have almost universal appeal amongst the villagers. If something happened to her, the position would more than likely be given to the white-haired pervert, since he was both a student of the Sandame and the teacher of the Yondame. That would be an unmitigated disaster, because he was certain that the man's irresponsible behavior was not entirely a charade. An irresponsible Hokage was worse than no Hokage at all. Itachi suppressed an exasperated sigh. They had not managed to get out of the village before Asuma and Kurenai had caught up to them. Kisame was just itching for a fight, and he wasn't entirely sure he'd be able to hold him back. After introductions were made, and he looked into the eyes of his former comrades only to see that they wanted him dead, the fight was met, and he found himself involved in a small genjutsu battle with Kurenai. He merely turned the woman's genjutsu around on her, when even without the Mangekyo he could have done so much worse. Despite all appearances, he was still loyal to Konoha, and the shinobi of Konoha were still his comrades. He didn't want to kill them if he didn't have to. The battle continued for a little while, and eventually Kakashi showed up and pulled Kurenai out of a tight spot. He felt slightly sick at turning the Tsukuyomi against his former captain, but it was better that the man learn of it now from him rather than face Madara one day with no knowledge of its existence. While in the world of the Tsukuyomi, he couldn't go easy on the man even though he wanted to. If Kakashi suspected anything were up, he could do something to blow his cover. Kakashi would survive though, and wake up eventually after this was over. Sasuke had managed to do so without too much damage. But then again, children's minds were far more resilient than those of adults. When Mato Guy and some brown-haired jounin who bore something of a resemblance to that bastard Danzo showed up, he knew that it was time to leave. He didn't need half of Konoha's remaining shinobi on his and Kisame's asses, especially now when the Akatsuki's hunt for the Jinchuriki was beginning. Naruto was no longer in town, so remaining was pointless. Kisame growled as he and Itachi followed the host for the Kyuubi, and his guard at a discreet distance. He'd been robbed of what could have been the fight of a lifetime. Him against one of the former Guardian 12, Konoha's legendary green beast, and whoever the hell that was who came and assisted them. The fact that he didn't know who the brown-haired guy was and whether or not he was strong niggled at him for a while as he and Itachi pursued their target, until he finally broke down and pulled out his bingo book. Barely paying any attention to the road, he flipped through the pages looking for either the correct picture or a description that matched. Eventually, he found it near the back of the book and snorted with disgust when he did. The brown-haired guy was a rather standard Konoha jounin who only merited an entry in the book because of his skills as a con artist. There was a mention that he'd been using his genin team in cons recently. One of the genin on that team just so happened to be their target. If the little brat thought he could trick them and flee, he would be getting a very unpleasant surprise. Come to think of it, there was no reason that he couldn't cut the boy's legs off the minute he was captured to prevent such things. The boy didn't need legs to survive, and would need to be held for a while anyways until the group could get enough practice in to synchronize the extraction process. The newest member Deidara lacked the necessary concentration skills to maintain the jutsu for longer than an hour or so. Asuma sighed as he disarmed the last of Kakashi's traps and dragged the unconscious man to his bed. He had briefly thought of bringing Kakashi to the hospital, but decided against it. No shinobi liked to wake up in the hospital, and the hospital was so swamped right now that it was best not to go there unless it was serious. He would bring him there though if he didn't awaken in a few hours. Kurenai was commenting on the ingenuity of the traps surrounding Kakashi's door and windows. He had a feeling that Kakashi either hired the Uzumaki boy to do them or stole the boy's notes. One or two of them were rather effective classics that were meant to be noticed so one would become overconfident and miss the other traps until it was far too late. Guy was looking somewhat nervous, but he understood. Kakashi had been Guy's best friend as well as his eternal rival since the two of them were children, and was naturally Q1 concerned about him. Kakashi and Guy never mentioned the best friend part, but it was obvious to anyone who watched their interactions. Guy had graduated the academy a year and a half after Kakashi at the age of 7, and proven himself to almost be Kakashi's equal any number of times. People tended not to notice this, however, as Guy had always looked and acted like a loser. Many people had learned that Guy wasn't the loser he appeared to be the hard way after they'd had the shit beaten out of them by the gay-looking weirdo in green. As he sat discussing what had happened, and waiting for Kakashi to wake up, Kakashi's student Sasuke let himself into the man's apartment. From the look on the boy's face, it seemed that there actually was someone in Konoha that the boy cared about besides himself. He, Kurenai, and Guy remained quiet about Itachi. Who knew how the boy would react to discovering that his brother had returned, especially since the boy had mentioned swearing to kill his brother if he ever saw him again. It wouldn't do to lose the last of the Uchiha because they had let something slip and the child had gone off half-cocked believing he could defeat someone on Itachi's level. From what little action he'd seen from Itachi during that fight, he could tell that the young man had truly earned his S-class ranking in the bingo book. At the moment, Uchiha Sasuke was maybe ranked at a high C or perhaps a low B. While the boy had completed an A-ranked mission, that had been mainly due to Kakashi and an ungodly amount of luck. As Sasuke was asking Kurenai about Kakashi's condition, Yamashiro Aoba completely blew it. He'd shown up and started asking about Itachi and his objectives at what had to be the absolute worst time. Next thing everyone knew, the Uchiha boy was running out the room, and he had a feeling that it wasn't to go and have a good cry. Someone should go after him, Kurenai said. Anyone feel like they're up to dragging a struggling Uchiha with an activated Sharingan back and holding him captive for however long it takes for him to calm down and the situation to blow over? He asked. Everyone looked at each other waiting to see who would make the first move. That's what he thought. Things like this had been so much easier when there were other Uchiha around to deal with their wayward offspring. Guy sighed. He'd drawn the short straw, and would now be hunting down a highly upset Uchiha who was more than likely heading straight towards the enemy. The enemy in this case was Uchiha Itachi, and some large blue guy who had come to Konoha to kidnap the Uzumaki boy. While he was reasonably certain of the Uchiha boy's intended destination, he did a quick check of the village to make sure the child hadn't run off to have a panic attack somewhere. After all, it wasn't entirely inconceivable that he would do so, considering the number Itachi had done on him when he was 8. He barely suppressed a frustrated sigh when a quick interrogation of the gate guards had revealed that Sasuke had run out of town and down the road. Great. He knew that it wouldn't be as simple as crawling into whatever space the Uchiha child had holed himself up in and comforting the boy. Hopefully the child hadn't gotten too far in the head start he'd been given, and he would be able to catch up soon. Uchiha were made for speed, however, so things didn't look good in that area. A Uchiha who was desperate, and given the head start Sasuke had been given, could already be halfway to Shakuba by now. Well, if he failed to catch Sasuke in time, he would do 5,000 sit-ups then 5,000 push-ups while he waited for Kakashi to kill him. That man had been in Konoha. That man had been in Konoha targeting his teammates. That man had been in Konoha targeting his teammates, and he'd hurt Kakashi. That man had been in Konoha targeting his teammates, he'd hurt Kakashi, and now he was going after Naruto. When had Naruto become Naruto to him? Naruto had left town with someone called Jiraiya on some sort of trip, and they didn't know Itachi was after them. He didn't entirely know why that man was after them. All he knew was that that man had taken out their family to test his abilities, and now he was going after his teammates. Was it to test his abilities as well? Kakashi was said to be at something approaching Kage level, and Naruto was incredibly powerful, especially when he called on the power of the Kyuubi. Why come now though? Both Naruto and Kakashi had the same amount of power that they had a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago even. The only thing that was different was that Konoha's security was at an all-time low thanks to the invasion, making it easier to slip in and out of the village without being noticed. If you didn't want to be noticed, however, why attempt to kidnap someone like Naruto whose absence would be quickly noticed despite the number of people who tried to pretend he didn't exist, much less start a battle with Itachi Kakashi in the middle of the village? It didn't make sense. Nothing about that man made sense, however. He would make it to Naruto in time, and warn him before he faced that man. Today, he would either kill that man and avenge the clan, or he would die. It was quite likely that he would die, and if he did, he would do anything in his power to take that man down with him. Luck was a part of a shinobi's skill set, and no matter how powerful a ninja was, they could still be brought down by a lucky shot. He would do his best to make that shot. That's it for part 7. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.